Hey everyone, Just Gamer here. No Fantano character because I wanted to come on here and talk about something a little different than usual. And hopefully I'm filming this kind of in a different setup as usual, so you might hear the stool that I'm sitting on creaking, and my mic obviously doesn't have a pop filter. Hopefully it doesn't. Oh god, I hope I didn't keep that in. That would be mean. Anyways, I want to say first off that this is not the Let's Argue that I was asking about earlier in this year. That one has been canceled just because when I did film my responses to that, it was in a group setting. I was trying out a different format and it ended up being a little too chaotic for the video, and it just didn't feel honest to me sitting down giving my personal thoughts on your responses. So that video has been canceled. I'll do another one at another time, I promise. I'm trying to get Fantano back on board. And for example, I filmed a video about a week ago doing redux scores for all the battles that I have already judged on this channel, kind of giving my updated thoughts, my updated scores, and then hopefully that will lead into a new wave of Fantano videos or Fantano reviews on this channel. So I really want to catch up. But what I want to come on and do here today is talk about something pretty important, which, as you can tell by the title, is ethnic casting. This isn't inspired by any tweet in specific. I'll talk about why I made this video near the end of it. But I understand that a lot of you are probably pretty tired talking about ethnic casting at this point. It's a pretty tired subject in FRB, and I understand that a lot of people don't want to necessarily keep having this discussion. And what I'm here to do today is not necessarily to add anything new. I have kind of three things that I want to go over about this video before we start at all, which is that first off, before anyone gets too concerned, this video isn't really a call out on anyone. I'll be mentioning some people by name. I'll be mentioning some events that don't have people by name, and there'll be a ton of things that we talk about in general with this subject. It's kind of hard to not talk about certain examples and whatevers in something like ethnic casting anyway, and I don't really want to avoid that. But this video is not meant to be an attack on anyone it's talking about, and I really don't want to treat it as an attack on anyone in specific. If anything, it is a request for introspection. Another thing that I want to come on here and do is provide a public asset as a ethnic casting kind of talking board, because we have the document that we formed at the start of the FRB talk, but that doesn't really get sent around a lot, and it actually covers a lot of the points that a lot of people often bring up and ask about. And if you notice, people ask about these points again and again and again and again a lot. And so having some kind of like video, something public like this that you can point someone to talk about ethnic casting and kind of go over everything, I think is a useful thing to have. Hopefully we'll see if it ends up being that useful at all. But the main reason I wanted to do this video is because I kind of want to take a step back and look at how the introduction of ethnic casting has kind of influenced this community. Specifically, I want to talk about something that I think has changed, something that I think is good, and something that I think is bad that has occurred as an effect of ethnic casting. I think it's kind of important, to me at least, a year and a half after its like formal introduction with the FRB talk, to kind of take that step back and look at how we talk about it now and what has changed because of it, and just in general kind of look at how we've treated the topic, and hopefully that'll form what we will do in the future. So before we move on too far, I'm gonna start at the top. If you still don't really understand ethnic casting, which a few of you might not, let me get all of those things out of the way right now. And that's our first topic, is just what is ethnic casting straight up. I'm going to be reading from my laptop a bit here, so you'll see me kind of looking off screen. Hopefully I'll put something on screen while I do this so it doesn't look too boring. But yeah, I want to take a second and quickly go over it. So ethnic casting refers to the casting of a character's voice and body actor accurately to the character and actor's race, not necessarily their country of origin. And in terms of ethnic casting, if a character doesn't have a clear race, basing the casting off of their culture if there is like some semblance that you can kind of pick off of. This country of origin point has a little more to do with the idea that it's this community and it's a very small community, and that we aren't really able to do that super well right now. Bigger industries might try to shoot for something like that more, but even then, that's still a different subject and a different point of contention in general. Again, I'll reiterate that everything I'm going to be talking about here, we have a document that goes over everything. I will link it in the description of this video, so if you have any other questions, that will require a little more explanation. Hopefully that doc will have it. If not, feel free to speak to me. But why are we talking about ethnic casting in general? What is the importance of ethnic casting as a subject in general? And my general reasons for it personally are that it avoids potentially harmful stereotypical like portrayals. Intentionally or otherwise, any portrayal that isn't ethnically casted has a unintended chance that it could come off as harmful and offensive. Again, just because the creator doesn't have that kind of intention and nothing within the portrayal on its face can be seen as offensive, there are still things that a lot of people have been unnerved by, even again outside of this community specifically, and that's kind of why ethnic casting is here. Another thing is just helps portray the characters more accurately, I would argue, because we make a lot of points about voice accuracy and kind of a lot of things like that. If you care about the character's accuracy, something else that's important to them is their race, and so that's another thing that you should keep in mind, in my opinion. And the last thing is that it gives people of color more opportunities in voiceover spaces. And there's a belief that POC people have a lot of opportunities already, and this is, if anything, only restricting it for white people. But, you know, the honest thing is that if you kind of look at it as a whole, in a lot of online spaces and in a lot of spaces in general, they are predominantly led by white people. And so if you do want a more even kind of score, then ethnic casting is kind of the right path to that, in my opinion. There's an idea that in a perfect world, anyone should be able to play anyone, and to that extent, I agree. But unfortunately, we do exist in a world with a lot of prejudices that a lot of people hold, myself included, probably. And unfortunately, we just have to kind of try to account for that the best we can. Ethnic casting is really a response to the imperfect world that we currently live in. And that kind of, once we've reached that equilibrium, a true equilibrium, the hope is that then we can then go on to have the conversation about true blind casting, about race not mattering at all in terms of casting. So the next thing I want to get into is, now that we've explained ethnic casting, there are a couple questions that come up a lot in these conversations. And I kind of want to address a few of them that I think I can address. And again, the rest will be in the document linked. The first thing is that people of color can play white characters, but not the other way around. And yes, that is due to a couple things. The first being that white people, white actors, will and do have a lot of opportunities already. They aren't really getting less opportunities, I would say. They are still, for the most part, probably going to be fine. And a lot of the stereotypes that I mentioned about before, the things that could be potentially harmful to people of color, don't really apply as much to white people. There's not a lot of stereotypes about white people that are straight up like on the level of other races. Something else to keep in mind is that this doesn't mean that any person of color can play any person of color. I personally am Asian. I couldn't play a Hispanic character or a black character under ethnic casting. And a Hispanic person couldn't play an Asian character or a black character, so on and so forth. In terms of mixed actors and mixed characters, that is honestly up to you, the director, to kind of decide how important each part of their identity is. And that's one of those things that it's not a great thing to hear, but it's kind of those things where you've just got to do your research and make that argument. If you can find a mixed actor that fits both parts, absolutely go for it. But I think that in the case of a mixed actor or a mixed character, you shouldn't boil someone down to numbers, but I do think keep that kind of thing in mind when you're doing casting. And yeah, ultimately, I would also recommend asking other people of the same race as this actor and character on how you should approach this casting to just get a little more advice. Now, on the subject of POC characters being played by someone of the different race, this conversation happens a lot, and it often kind of links back, in my personal experience, to two characters, which is Apu and Samurai Jack. These two characters are brought up a lot in the conversation in terms of it was fine until it wasn't, and they're still more or less fine characters for a lot of people. And the important things to note, in my opinion, is first off that these have been viewed as exceptions. These should be viewed as exceptions. These are kind of a rare case where the history of the voice actor and the character are so kind of intertwined. In a lot of other cases, it isn't this complicated. And also, there are interviews online from the voice actors of both these characters kind of talking about how they are exceptions and that they shouldn't really be considered in this conversation at all, and that using them as talking points in this conversation really nullifies the topic. And I think that's something important to consider as well, is that while it's true that these voice actors are important parts of these characters, they themselves have gone on to say that it's not really what they would agree with today, but it's not something that they regret having done. Anime localization and localization in general is another very complicated topic, but at least in my personal opinion, localization is not changing a character's race. Simply because a character speaks another language doesn't change their race. I speak English right now, but I am Vietnamese. I am Asian. Just because I speak English, it doesn't necessarily make me not Vietnamese or Asian. So that, I think, is kind of my thoughts on localization. Again, very complex topic. You can find a lot of other people talking about it. These are my personal thoughts. And the last thing is, why does it matter for FRB? This, I think, is the most important thing about this that I kind of want to touch on. And there's this idea that in the larger world of voiceover, media creation, and media in general, they haven't really solved it. And that there are plenty of examples where they didn't care. So why should we? And in my opinion, we should be able to work through these issues with the industry. We shouldn't wait until our problems are solved by a bigger force. And I understand that it's probably best to let people better experienced about this subject kind of tackle it first. But in my opinion, ethnic casting has been talked about for a very long time already, and it wouldn't hurt to just kind of follow along with where they're at a certain point. And it's also, I think, important to note that just because something was done before doesn't mean that they would necessarily agree with it now. If they do, then that's a different topic in general, and we'll discuss those as those exceptions come up. But I think it's kind of unfair to point at something that was done, say, even 10 years ago, and say they didn't care then, so we shouldn't care now. Times change, standards change. You don't live by the rules of the people who founded your country, for example. You don't live by those ideals, but they're still kind of where you come from. You can be better than the people who came before you, essentially. And another thing is that people believe that this is just kind of a small, funny online community and that it doesn't matter because we're just making comedy videos, more or less. And I understand that kind of thing where it's like there are a lot more injustices out there, even involving ethnic casting, that we could shake our fists at. But for me personally, I'm not really in those communities. I wouldn't feel comfortable speaking on those communities' behalf, but this is my community. I'm very much a part of this community. Any piece of content, any piece of media, as silly or dumb as it may be, has that kind of potential to be harmful, to be offensive, for lack of a better word. But I should also add that within the context of FRB, I'm not doing this, and the people talking about this aren't doing this to police. This isn't necessarily a kind of thing where we want to police people. We want to charge at people for doing something wrong. We view it as a recommendation and a request. Now, this kind of request and recommendation carries a lot heavier consequences than a normal bad decision, such as like a mismatch in art or bad editing or a bad beat choice, obviously. But I think like every other choice made for a rap battle, you can either stand behind your choice or you can admit to your mistake. And that is, absolutely up to you. And same as it is up to me and everyone else to kind of look at that and judge your content and to a certain extent what you choose to do based on this decision, much like any other in a rap battle. And I want to reiterate one more time that this is not some kind of fear-monger iron fist situation where I understand that a lot of smaller creators have this fear that they step the wrong way and will kind of cast them aside, outcast them. And I think in the case of smaller creators, I don't think this is true. I think I will maybe be disappointed if you don't end up ethnically casting, but I understand in the case of smaller creators that you may not have the assets, money, or talent in terms of like finding talent to get someone who would fit the role and is ethnically casted. But I think what's important is making that effort to ask around and try. But once you've done that, and if it doesn't work out, I think that's fair. I think bigger creators have that obligation more so. The bigger the creator, the more obligation I personally see that they should uphold and try to do that, because they absolutely should have the resources for that kind of thing. Now to get into what I think has happened since we first talked about ethnic casting all the way back in, I think, April of 2023. Which isn't that far back, but I think a decent amount has changed since then. The first thing I think that has changed is just that there are, at least to me, feels like there are less minority battles now, less battles using minority characters, rather. I went and did a search to the best of my personal ability, and at least on YouTube, what I found is that there were around 80 battles with minority characters in 2022, so a year before we introduced ethnic casting on a wide scale, and there are around 60 in 2024. Now, that isn't a massive drop, but I do also want to consider that a few of those in 2024 are still not perfectly ethnically casted. And again, it's not a massive drop per se. You could chalk that up to the year, and I guess we'll just have to wait as time passes to see if this is really a dampening factor overall. But I've heard a few stories about how people have had to cancel projects and stuff because they didn't want to kind of figure out the whole ethnic casting thing with the character that they were going to use. So I think it's fair to say that there is some tangible impact to the battles that people are making now. And to me, it's hard to confirmedly say this is good or bad, because I do understand that it's bad that we are getting less minority battles in general, and that people are more afraid to make battles with minority characters based on the issue of casting. But on the right side of it, I think that we have a lot less harmful and offensive portrayals of them in rap battles now. I think we have done a pretty good job of avoiding that kind of thing since we first introduced this, issue. Something good that I think has happened is that we have massively widened the pool of VAs in this community, whether that is certain people of color in this community becoming more popular for roles. Examples I have here are people like Grassman and Rosenthal, people who started getting more roles, I think, because of their race, and they are now in a more popular fray, or people outside of this community being introduced in. I have a number of examples here. Bear with me here. This is like my fourth time trying to pronounce these names. Langle, Joanna Lynn Alonzo, Kobe Van Bogart, and Seer of Words. Those are the people I have on this list. I really hope I didn't butcher any of those. I'm going to feel like such an asshole if I did. But yeah, I think this is a pretty good thing that we're increasing the range of VAs in this community. If you aren't in FRB, or if you're not as familiar with FRB, there is long-running jokes of there being the pool of 5 popular VAs. And I feel like we have massively expanded that since the introduction of ethnic casting, which again I think is great. But to kind of focus on what I think is a really important topic, and one of the main things that has happened since ethnic casting that I think is not as positive, is that there's this complicated understanding of race now in general in FRB. The topic of ethnic casting has opened the topic of race in general more in this kind of space. And people are a lot of white people are coming in contact with this issue and kind of working their way through it, which I understand that we are, again, only a year and a half into it, and it's, time is time. But there are unfortunately people of color in FRB, or who used to be in FRB, who no longer feel super comfortable being in FRB because seeing how people respond to ethnic casting and race in general have made them feel unsafe or unwelcomed in one way or another. I have a few statements from people here that I will personally read out. I won't be able to read out the full thing just because time-wise, and I don't think either of us want that. But I'll say who it is. I'll put the whole thing up. You can kind of pause and read it, and then I'll go over the important parts, in my opinion. So the first statement here is from RNG, aka Calvin. Again, here's the whole thing. You can pause to read that. After a year and a half of ethnic casting talks, the things that really happened is more people were made aware of the nuances of race as a point to consider for creating rap battles, and the norm of getting white people for things like Asian and anime roles was challenged. But also at the same time, there are people who pushed back on the change. A big part of the remaining issue is that people began trivializing or passive-aggressively taking shots at this legitimate issue, which is a thing we take issue with, because from our perspective, when it felt like us minorities were screaming into the void for the entire community to listen, we were only met with either the same repeated arguments or snarky passive-aggressive comments. And this comes from someone who, like me, has had a lot of discussion about this. Calvin is, again, someone who is very outspoken about this issue, and I think understands the kind of frustration that we feel when a lot of people will joke or kind of brush off either in the same convo or just, randomly people will joke about and brush off ethnic casting as this kind of thing where it's like, aren't people getting so mad about it, And that to me feels not great, obviously, that this issue we really care about is just kind of being viewed as us overreacting, for lack of a better word. The next statement I have is from Lavi. Some of you might know them as Yugen Vinny. Again, here's their full thing. This is a massive statement, but again, I can't go into the whole thing. Last December, some friends informed me that my stance on ethnic casting was being misinterpreted and spread around like game of telephone. I went into FRB and gave my own thoughts on ethnic casting. I do not care about ethnic casting for most anime characters as long as accents aren't involved. This does not mean I am cool with white people playing any Asian, especially real-life figures or live-action characters. This is going to address some scenarios that have been brought up by dear friends, but Hanzo from Overwatch is one character I use as an example. He clearly has an accent. I wouldn't personally care about casting whoever as Persona protagonists, for example, because their English voices would not require an Asian accent to be used or imitated, but Hanzo is a no. Bottom line, these are my thoughts, mine. I do not appreciate my words being used to defend other people's actions. I'm not going to care about this, but other Asian people in FRB will. I will not be there to defend you or save the day, nor will I even care to. Lavi kind of brings up an interesting point about this to me, which is that within the group of like people of color who they can have their own thoughts on the subject as well, and I think that's fine. I think it's important to let people with different experiences kind of take their own approaches on ethnic casting, whether it's someone who has more leniency to the subject in general or someone who's a lot more strict about it, as long as they are a person of color talking about their own casting. I think even in terms of Asian characters casting, Lavi can have this thought, but with regards to other castings like Hispanic or Black characters, that to them is not their kind of territory, and I don't think that they should judge on that, and I think they would agree with that. Same with, I think, any other race in terms of, I think a person from that group can judge how their group should be casted from person to person, and there can be disagreements about that. But in the case of what Lavi's saying, they are a bit of an exception here, is that they personally will not do a thing, and we can disagree about that. I've had disagreements about that with them before, but I respect their choices as a fellow Asian. But both of us are not going to have the same kind of understanding when it comes to white people or any other race kind of choosing this leniency with Asian characters. I have a more positive note coming from GreenOwl, someone I have talked about a few times about ethnic casting and how it impacts their experience as a newcomer in this community. This is what they had to say about it. I'm a big advocate for ethnic casting. I also like how we don't really enforce it, but respect when people do it. I feel that's a very powerful way to prevent people from rebelling. I haven't been here this long in FRB, but I feel very welcomed as a minority, much more than IRL when I moved to America as an Indian. I can't say how FRB was before ethnic casting since I wasn't here, but I can say it has made an overall positive impact here. And I think contrary to this, we have someone who GreenOwl hasn't really had as much experience dealing with the kind of conversations and complexities, maybe even, of the ethnic casting conversation. But I think it's a good reminder that, at least to someone like them, ethnic casting has only benefited their experience, and they still very much support it. I think it's a good thing to have that kind of support, even outside of the people who you've probably seen talk about it a lot. So, again, I just think another point worth bringing up. And the last person I want to talk about is Dani, who has his statement here. And this one I do kind of want to read out in full, because I think his statement in specific really, I think, is important to me. Since 2023, I've always felt a little off about expressing my culture, but this year I felt very uncomfortable, almost to the point where I don't really feel welcome in the community anymore. I feel like there are a lot of jokes and weird comments that get by with no real consequence or anything to show that they learned, which makes me feel very excluded. At the same time, I get constantly asked ethnic casting questions I don't know or care about, constantly told shit like I'd love to cover this, but I can't say the N-word, and I've just been constantly typecasted to only do Black, Sen, and Mexican voices. I'm not the greatest VA, but I've shown several impressions, tones, and pitches I can do across my own battles and others, so it just kind of sucks to constantly get in the booth to record the same voice. For lack of a better term, I felt more like a diversity hire than an actual creator, which is why I've kind of stepped back from public spaces the last couple of days. This statement, I think, is a really nuanced one, and it's a very hard one to kind of discuss. And it's the idea that a lot of people have just been kind of boiled down to their race because of this conversation. People like Dani. And when ethnic casting was first getting around, Lavi also was getting casted a lot in just any project with an Asian character. And I think it's not great. It's an understandable byproduct of ethnic casting. It's an unavoidable thing that because we don't have as many people in this community, because the pool has been shrunk from basically everyone into one specific race, understandably, people will get typecasted. But I think to kind of lock someone into that typecasting is something that we've got to learn to understand, that as much as these people care about their race and their identity, they cannot be limited to it. And that I think is a very complicated and a really hard subject to get at, which is why I don't expect everyone to kind of perfectly nail that, but it's something that I hope that with time we get better with. And on the topic of Dani, he's actually kind of why I wanted to make this video in the first place. Dani was going to make a video at the end of this year talking about his experiences in FRB and just the community spaces. And the way he was going to go about this is he wanted to show a series of screenshots of, I'll be honest, like a spectrum, I would say, of pretty racist comments or pretty racially charged comments at the very least. And what ended up happening was that people who knew of this project, white people, began pressuring him upon seeing their peers and close friends on there. Someone blocked him over it. And the whole subject in general just kind of made him especially feel like even the people that he thought he could trust aren't the allies that they have been claiming they are. And that's kind of why I wanted to take this opportunity to just kind of talk about ethnic casting and say that this is really only one facet of the issue, that ethnic casting is, again, just the tip of the iceberg. It's something important that I think we should work towards, but it is not the be-all end-all, and in fact, it has a lot of consequences, obviously. There are many points to touch on outside of ethnic casting, such as jokes that can be seen as racist, as we talked about, and a general lack of empathy towards how people of color can feel about their own race in this conversation. A lot of white people feel very comfortable making jokes or kind of telling people of color how they should respond to an issue that is, in at least from people of color's perspective, uniquely theirs. And to be completely transparent, I'm not perfect about any of this either. I have made mistakes about ethnic casting before, whether that is misunderstanding a character's casting or, more notably, there are two battles that I was involved in the production of that I completely let slide. Those two examples are Yugimoto versus Moon Knight by Freshie Canal, where I had a conversation with him about the casting of Cam Steady as Yugimoto. And in that conversation, we talked about how Yugi isn't specified to be from anywhere. And so there was never anything that outright said he is Asian. There are only bits and pieces of things there, and it's hard to kind of infer. And Cam was kind of a legacy hire in terms of he obviously has a lot of connection with Yugimoto and a lot of connection to the community. And in that blindness, I ultimately said that I understand why. And I kind of told him, yes, he could cast Cam. Looking back on that decision, I feel like I was clouded by the idea that I still personally think Yugimoto should be played by an Asian person. And I was kind of clouded by the idea of the casting of Cam and the idea that this project really was only happening due with his involvement. Another example of this was something like Kokichi Oma versus The Imposter Among Us rematch by Game Plus 64. Game Plus 64 had a lot of thoughts on kind of how to approach that project because it was being worked on as ethnic casting was happening as a conversation, and there was a lot of debate over how the casting should happen. And I was one of the people approached to it, and I understood where he was coming from in the terms of it's a legacy casting. It made sense that it would be him and Michael Stark again playing the two characters. But probably if anyone else came to me with that idea, I probably wouldn't have agreed as much as I did. I probably would have been a little more hesitant to agree to it. So again, I have let my own blindness kind of make decisions that don't align with what I say. And that's something that I just want to get better at as time goes on. I think that's the kind of thing where with this entire topic in general, I think it's just something we gotta, as a community, get better with. It's why I don't judge any one person in specific for when they make a mistake. I earnestly think that as a whole, we have a lot to do and we have a lot to try to move towards. But I think it's important to acknowledge what has changed, and it's important to acknowledge our shortcomings, and it's important to acknowledge just the topic in general. It's why I understand everyone is really, really, really damn sick of talking about ethnic casting. I, at times, am just as tired as everyone else. But it's never not going to matter. The conversation always needs to be had when we do have it, in my opinion. With that being said, thank you so much for watching this video. I probably mean it more than usual here. And I will see you all another time. Goodbye. Oh, God, it has been filming this whole time. Thank God.